there is a specific lie that rests at the foundation of the modern Western world. It is the story of 1947, a fable of unprecedented generosity that we are told saved civilization. The official narrative claims that the United States, standing as the lone unscarred titan after World War II, looked upon a burning, starving Europe and opened its wallet out of pure benevolence. We call this the Marshall Plan. We are taught that billions of dollars were gifted to rebuild nations, feed the hungry, and shield the innocent from tyranny. But if you close the history books and open the accounting ledgers, a much darker reality emerges. The Marshall Plan was not a charity, it was a purchase. It was the most sophisticated vendor financing scheme in human history, a calculated hostile takeover disguised as a rescue mission. It did not save Europe, it foreclosed on it. To understand the trap, you must first understand the bait. By the winter of 1947, Europe was not merely broken, it was suffering a cardiac arrest. The intricate machinery of civilization had been grounded to dust. Bridges lay in rivers, railways were twisted scrap, and the currencies of great empires were worth less than the paper they were printed on. In Germany, commerce had ceased entirely. A loaf of bread could not be bought with Reichmarks, only with cigarettes or chocolate. Then came the cold. The winter of 1947 was a meteorological apocalypse that froze coal stockpiles solid. In London and Berlin, people were freezing to death in their own living rooms. The continent was a vacuum of misery ready to implode. However, the true panic was not happening in the ruins of Berlin, but in the boardrooms of Washington, D.C. The United States was terrified, but not of Soviet tanks. They were terrified of their own factories. During the war, the American economy had tripled in size, transforming into a production juggernaut without equal. But with the war over, the government contracts vanished. Millions of soldiers were returning home to an economy that suddenly had no customers. The U.S. was producing 50% of the world's industrial goods, but the American consumer couldn't buy it all. The ruling class was staring down the barrel of a new Great Depression crisis of overproduction. They needed to export their steel, their cars, and their wheat, or their own economy would collapse. There was just one insurmountable problem. The customer was broke. Europe needed American goods, but they had no dollars to pay for them. This was the dollar gap, the defining crisis of the era. The global trading system was locked. If Europe couldn't buy, America couldn't sell. If America couldn't sell, the factories would close and the chaos of the 1930s would return. The United States didn't help Europe because it was kind. It helped Europe because it was kinder. The Marshall Plan was the solution to an American liquidity crisis, not a European humanitarian one. The genius of the plan lay in its circular logic. The U.S. government taxed its own citizens, transferred that money to European governments, who were then legally mandated to use that same money to pay American corporations for goods. The money never actually left the American ecosystem. It flowed from the Treasury to Europe and bounced immediately back to General Motors, U.S. Steel, and big agriculture. It was a massive, taxpayer-funded subsidy for American industry. But for Europe, this money came with invisible strings that would slowly tighten into chains. The most insidious of these strings was a mechanism almost never mentioned in school textbooks, the counterpart funds. When the U.S. shipped $100 million worth of wheat to France, the French government sold that wheat to its own people for francs. That pile of francs collected from French citizens was the counterpart fund. Logic dictates this money belonged to France, but under the rules of the treaty, it didn't. The French government could not spend a single franc of this money without the express permission of an American administrator sitting in Paris. This gave Washington veto power over the internal budgets of sovereign nations. If France wanted to build public housing, the U.S. could say no. If they wanted to build a port for American ships, the U.S. said yes. It was a soft coup, allowing Washington to steer the political destiny of Europe without ever deploying a soldier. While the Marshall Plan secured the continent, its sharper edge was reserved for America's greatest economic rival, the British Empire. We often view the transition of global power from London to New York as a peaceful passing of the torch. In reality, it was an assassination. In 1945, Britain was bankrupt, but it still controlled the sterling area, a massive closed-garden economy comprising the Commonwealth and colonies where trade was conducted in pounds, not dollars. This was a fortress wall that American exports could not penetrate. Washington was determined to smash it. The weapon they used was debt. When a desperate Britain came to Washington in 1946, begging for a loan to feed its people, the U.S. agreed, but the terms were poison. They demanded that Britain make the pound sterling fully convertible into US dollars within 1 year. It sounded like a technicality, but it was a death sentence. As soon as convertibility went live in 1947, the world dumped their pounds to get their hands on the only currency that mattered, the dollar. A run on the Bank of England ensued, draining Britain's reserves in weeks. The pound collapsed, the sterling area was fractured, and London was forced to accept its new status as a client state. The Marshall Plan funds that followed were simply the severance package for a retired empire. With Britain neutralized, the American planners turned their eyes to the continent's geography. They looked at the map of Europe with its dozens of borders and tariffs and saw inefficiency. American corporations like Ford and IBM didn't want to navigate 20 different tax codes. They wanted one massive, standardized market, just like they had at home. Therefore, a core requirement of the Marshall Plan was European integration. The U.S. forced the French and Germans to merge their coal and steel industries, laying the foundation for what would become the European Union. The EU was not born solely from a European dream of peace. It was incubated in Washington to create a frictionless landing zone for American capital. By the 1950s, the operation was a resounding success. The dollar had replaced gold and the pound as the lifeblood of global commerce. Europe was rebuilding, yes, but it was being rebuilt as an annex of the American economy. The German miracle was fueled by American machinery and paid for with American loans. But as the 1960s rolled in, the trap began to mutate. The dollar gap reversed into a dollar glut. The U.S., now fighting wars in Vietnam and funding massive social programs, was printing money recklessly. These dollars flooded into Europe, and European leaders began to realize that the green paper they held was no longer as good as gold. This led to the rebellion of Charles de Gaulle. The French president saw clearly that the U.S. was using its exorbitant privilege to buy up European industry with money it printed out of thin air. It was the heist of the century. In a bold act of financial warfare, de Gaulle ordered the French Navy to transport shiploads of paper dollars back to America and demanded the gold that was promised in exchange. Other nations followed. The gold vaults of Fort Knox began to drain. The bluff was called. The trap the U.S. had built was now threatening to bankrupt the architect. Washington's response was swift and brutal. They didn't fix the economy. They changed the rules of the game. In 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and closed the gold window. In plain English, the U.S. defaulted. They told the world that the dollars they held were no longer redeemable for anything. The link between money and reality was severed. Europe was left holding billions in paper currency that was suddenly backed by nothing but faith. They were furious, but they were helpless. They had been integrated so deeply into the dollar system that they couldn't leave it without destroying their own economies. But faith is a fragile thing, and the U.S. needed a new anchor to replace gold. They found it in the sands of Saudi Arabia. In 1974, the U.S. struck the deal that sealed the trap forever: the petrodollar. The arrangement was simple. The U.S. would provide absolute military protection to the Saudi royal family. In exchange, the Saudis would price every barrel of oil in U.S. dollars. If Germany or France wanted to buy energy to run the factories the Marshall Plan had built, they now had to acquire U.S. dollars first. This created a perpetual artificial demand for American currency. The trap had evolved into a self-sustaining engine. Europe had to produce cars, wine, and machinery to earn dollars. The United States simply had to print them. The Marshall Plan was the seed capital for this empire. It bought the loyalty, it built the infrastructure, and it installed the software of the global economy. Today, when we look at the gleaming cities of Europe, we see prosperity. But if you look closer, you see the bars of a golden cage forged in 1947, ensuring that the sun never truly sets on the American economy.